Hopefully by the end of this lesson, you'll be able to explain why this picture would be funny to a math teacher. Our objective is to be able to find inverse functions. That's the main objective. We also want to be able to determine if an inverse of a function is also a function. So those are the kinds of activities we're going to be doing today. So I'm going to go through on these videos and do some examples for you after I explain what an inverse function is. So we'll be finding inverse functions. In order to do that, we need to be able to identify what inverse operations are. And let me just point out, inverse means opposite, right? Or upside down. So that's kind of like the context of where we will be starting from. In addition, inverse functions occur in the reverse order or the inverse order, and functions that have x and y values, their inverse functions are going to actually be flip-flop. So the domain is the range and the range is the domain. This is your mastery ticket, so by the end of the lesson you should be able to calculate what the inverse function of this function is. You should be able to explain how to, it's in there twice, how to find an inverse function in your own words. You should also know what the horizontal line test and what it's used for. And lastly, you should be able to identify out of a list of functions which ones have inverses that are functions and which ones have inverses that are not functions. Why are we talking about inverse functions? Well, inverse functions are used in real life. You can think of examples of encoding and decoding messages. So encrypting and decrypting work in a similar way. We can also think about driving directions and reverse driving directions. If you've ever used Google Maps to map your way to somewhere and then you click on the arrow button that goes in reverse, that will flip all of those directions around and put them in the reverse order. So that is an inverse function. And if we really think about it, you are actually already very experienced with inverse functions, because every time you solve an equation for x, you're performing an inverse function. So you're doing all the steps individually one at a time. So I would consider all of you an expert in that already. This is just an example of inverse in the context of directions. Let's say I start off at Austin East High School and I got to turn right onto MLK because I need to go get a gut bomb at Chandler's, and then let's say I turn left on Castle and right on Magnolia and then left into Chandler's Deli. The inverse function of that is all opposite turns. So every right turn turns into a left turn and vice versa. And you're going in the reverse order, which is exactly what an inverse function does. Just for some context, we've been dealing with inverse operations this whole time. They are the opposite operations. So when you see inverse, you can kind of just think opposite, or I need to undo this. So here's a list for you to just kind of look at. Plus and minus are inverse, multiply and divide are inverse, square and square root, or cubing something and cube root are inverse operations of each other. And then I also put those exponentials on there because we've been studying those recently.